Coming up on this week's episode of Why Should I Trust You? The story of Ivermectin. We're taking a look at how a drug once called miraculous for its treatment of infections quickly turned into a political weapon during the COVID pandemic. Today, 5 years later, a lot of people are still angry over ivermectin. Why? Because this is ultimately a story about what happens when the scientific method crashes head-on into a polar opposite lived experience. And we'll speak to one of the leading research scientists who has run multiple clinical trials on ivermectin. We're back. We should just quickly introduce ourselves again because we're a new podcast. I'm Brenda Adhikari.
I'm Tom Johnson.
Maggie Bartlett.
Mark Azamalik.
That's right. We are back. Did everyone have fun during last week's episode?
Yes.
So much fun.
My mom told me that I'm too loud and I say like and too much.
Classic mom.
Right?
I haven't finished listening to it yet because it's so long. But the part I listened to was great.
Oh, great, Dr. Mark. Thank you. So listen, as you know, we are doing episodes right now that are looking at why so many people in this country say that they've lost trust in the science and public health and medical community. And particularly since the pandemic, it really has taken a nosedive. This week, we're going to focus on something that has and is continuing to accelerate this mistrust. And that is the subject of ivermectin. Now, look, this drug, as we know, became a flashpoint during the pandemic. And as of January 2025, the scientific consensus is that ivermectin is not effective at treating or preventing COVID. And look, this is after multiple big, rigorous, double-blind clinical trials. And they've concluded that the drug isn't effective at treating and preventing COVID. And they've tried it at different dosages. They've tried it on thousands of people. And that's where it stands. Now, you might ask, so why are we talking about it?
So
that's because, we've met so many people who are still convinced that it works. I can't tell you how many times that the conversation about ivermectin comes up. The other thing I've noticed is that there's actually even some instances where legislatively, ivermectin is still kind of alive and well. I saw that a bill is making its way through the Ohio State House right now, being championed by the Senate Republicans there, that would allow patients to basically force hospitals into administering drugs for off-label use if the hospital's own physicians refuse to do that. And that's because during the pandemic, as we know, a lot of hospitals refused to administer ivermectin. And the last thing I'll say, and I promise you I'm going to shut up after that. The last thing I'll say is, as you all know, I've been listening to a lot of Joe Rogan.
Yes.
And the reason being, I noticed after listening to a couple of episodes, I listened to like 40 of them, okay, in a row, like for 3 months worth of it. And what I saw was that in over half of them, he talks about COVID in not just just a quick way. He really talks about it. Like clearly this was a transformative moment in his life. But the one thing he talks a lot about is ivermectin. And there's one episode in particular, we got a little sound from that, and I just want you to listen to it. So let's take a listen.
Then I got COVID. And then when I got COVID, I got over it really quickly. And then I got attacked on CNN. So I was like, okay, what's going on here? Like, why are you guys upset that I took a certain medicine and got better? I've never even heard of such a thing. And they started labeling it, this ivermectin, as a horse dewormer, which is crazy because it won the Nobel Prize for people. So it was like I was watching this bizarre thing take place in scale on mass media against me. And I listed a bunch of different medications that I took. But for whatever reason, they labeled ivermectin as the thing that needed to be attacked. And they all in lockstep. MSNBC, CNN, newspapers, all of them making these ridiculous statements that I was taking veterinary medicine. I got medicine from a doctor, from a pharmacy.
Yeah, so that wasn't from months ago. That was from like less than 4 weeks ago. And we also know that he just recently spoke with Mel Gibson and they talked about ivermectin and they made some claims about cancer. So look, it is out there. It is still a very current topic and that's why we want to talk about it. And Tom, this whole episode was your idea.
Yeah, and
so talk to us.
I didn't. That's true.
Tom, how did we get here?
Yeah, how we got here. I mean, Rogan's right. It is a horse dewormer. He's also right that it is used for humans. He's also right that the guys that came up with this drug won the Nobel. So story begins back in the 70s in Japan. These two scientists are mucking around in the soil.
These are my favorite.
I think they were looking at it like a golf course near Tokyo and taking soil samples. They find a microbe. And flash forward, they turn that microbe into the basis of ivermectin, which proves to be a super effective treatment for parasitic infections in animals, basically deworming them. Think about livestock. Flash forward to 1987, ivermectin's approved for human use, and it's revolutionary. It's used to treat parasitic diseases like river blindness. Merck, the maker of ivermectin, teams up with WHO, and they start distributing it. It does a lot of good.
I mean, these were debilitating diseases.
Absolutely.
This is, a gift to humanity.
Right.
It was
Truly.
called Wonder Drug.
It was a wonder drug.
It's a wonder drug. It comes off patent. It's mass produced. It's inexpensive. And it's prescribed for all sorts of parasitic infections, right down things like head lice and scabies. So it
always comes back to dermatology.
Yeah, what is scabies? I just got to know. I don't know what that is.
Scabies is a infestation in your skin, a parasitic infestation of your skin. And it's little mites crawling around, digging burrows, and it itches like crazy.
Right.
Okay,
So
so I'm not going to sleep tonight. Go ahead.
2015, the two scientists take home the Nobel Prize. Enter the pandemic. Novel virus, emergency, chaos. There is a race to find treatments. Everybody wants a treatment. We don't have a treatment. Scientists around the globe start looking. And they start turning to ivermectin and start to examine that. A study comes out of Australia in April of 2020. It's small, and it shows early promise of ivermectin killing COVID in the lab at levels that are way beyond what a human being takes. But it's something.
And it's in a test tube.
It's in a test tube. It sparks a lot of interest. And that sort of gets the snowball rolling for ivermectin and COVID.
And I think that's the really interesting thing for me as a scientist that was happening at the time. If I put myself back, that we really wanted solutions. There was this novel virus that we didn't have a plan of attack for, and we wanted something, anything, as we started to see more cases. And what kind of grinds my gears a little bit is that this study, which is seminal and incredibly important, is about something in cell culture, which does not directly translate to how helpful it'll be for humans. There's so many steps in between, and those are kind of lost when media is clamoring that this is the solution. But before we can do our due diligence and do clinical trials, you've got to do all of the legwork in between. And just for example, 99.99% of the drugs that we examine for antiviral effects end up not making it to people, even if in culture they have an antiviral effect, because humans are so complex. You're looking at cells in a dish which have one type of response versus inside the human body where we have the innate immune system, the adaptive immune system, and we have all of these different things that we really can't elucidate until we get to in people.
Right. But let me ask you something, Maggie, because when you heard the basic headline out of the Australia study, was there any part of you that was kind of excited?
Absolutely, Burnett. I think it was so exciting to think that something off the shelf, something that was cheap, had low side effects in people, was widely distributed across the globe for parasitic infections, could be the solution.
Science wanted this to work. When they first heard the headlines, it sounded like a lot of people were potentially excited about the possibility.
And we've all seen the movie Lorenzo's Oil. Everybody thought this could be a Lorenzo's Oil moment, right? And it's not surprising that medicines get accidentally discovered. I mean, there are many things like that.
That's how most of them are discovered. Yeah,
it's very, very common, and everybody's ears perked. Scientists wanted to know, should we try this? And they did.
And you had a lot of studies start to follow.
Yeah.
And they start to get mixed results. And there are some other ones that come out that say, hey, there's even more promise than you thought.
Yeah.
Those stories start to get debunked. So public health says, hold, do not take this drug. We don't have enough evidence to say this is an effective treatment for COVID. But people are starting to hear the news and the headlines start to churn. And more Americans are starting to ask for it from their doctors. Doctors, of course, can prescribe drugs off-label.
They do it every day.
They do it every day.
Every day.
And especially in an urgent situation here where people are dying and we can't wait a year, 2 years for a study to
And there's no vaccine yet at this point.
There's no vaccine at this point. We're still in 2020.
Right. And, at the time, this is when there is a push for a vaccine. But right now, we still are looking for who's going to benefit from something like this. Is it, if we give it early, does it help? Can it prevent people from getting hospitalized? Remember, the images were hospitals are being overwhelmed.
Right.
There's not enough ventilators for people.
Yep.
So, of course, let's pull anything we can off the shelf.
It was like a kitchen sink moment.
It really was.
It was try everything.
Right.
Right. So we've talked to families that have taken it, attorneys that have represented families who took it and wanted to force the hospitals to give it to their loved ones. We've heard wrenching stories of loved ones saying, my husband, our father, is dying in that ICU right now. I'm hearing from my friends in my social media circle, I'm seeing headlines about the possibility of this drug working. I want it. What else do we got to lose? Like this is a dire moment. And so people start taking it and they start reporting out these like incredible stories of recovery.
Right.
One day on a ventilator, took ivermectin, a couple days later, they're being, moved back to the COVID ward because they're off the ventilator and recovering.
But we have to be careful here because just because you took ivermectin and you were on a ventilator, that's not the reason you came off the ventilator.
Right.
And that's the key moment and key distinction that a lot of people have a hard time grasping, especially when you're in the thick of it.
Yeah. People recovered from COVID.
Right.
It just so happens they may have taken ivermectin too. But anyway, the story
You can see why they thought it was because of ivermectin.
100%.
Because that was the only intervention that they were taking at the time.
Yeah. But
if you were in the hospital, it wasn't the only intervention you were getting.
Okay.
If you were in the hospital, you were on IV fluids, you were on maybe an antiviral, you were, on ventilator support.
Right.
You were being supportive. It's called supportive care. The doctors and nurses were propping you up, making sure every other organ system was being maximized so you could just get over that hump. Maybe there was a little ivermectin sprinkled in that you may have taken outside of the hospital before you got there. But doctors were not just sitting in wards, let's just try ivermectin and
That's a great point, Mark.
give everything else up.
Yep.
And I think it just goes to the help that big data has for this, right? So clinical trials are designed in such a way so that we can see what's the benefit of one intervention over the standard of care or supportive care. And these anecdotes end up being very powerful storytelling devices, especially when people want hope. They want something that could work. And I can absolutely relate to that. It was very scary during that period in time when you didn't know what to expect. And if you've heard from a friend of a friend that this might work, that might be more compelling to you than the studies, especially if the studies hadn't come out yet.
Right.
So as all this is bubbling,
Yeah.
end of 2020, Republican Senator Ron Johnson convenes a hearing, brings forward some ER doctors, and one of them testifies that ivermectin is a miraculous drug for treating COVID.
Mm-hmm.
The clip goes viral. So as we turn the corner into 2021, a lot of people are now buzzing about ivermectin and asking for it, demanding it, viewing this as the miracle treatment that we've all been praying for.
It basically becomes like political football.
Right.
Ivermectin is polarizing now because on one hand, you're hearing people saying that it's working. On the other hand, the scientific community is really becoming skeptical because the studies that once showed it was good, now some of those, when you look back, were really flawed.
Yes.
Some of them are so flawed that the publishing companies pull them back, say, forget about that study, we're retracting it.
Didn't they use the names of dead people or something?
Yeah, one of the earlier ones that was published, I think, in the spring of 2020 was pulled because by the fall in 2020, when they looked back, dead people were included in the analysis. So that is just a flawed design. And
fraudulent.
And fraudulent.
Yes. And part of why we have a retraction process, but that doesn't always correlate in time to what the public is hearing.
And at the time, we gave up. I mean, Maggie's like queen of like peer review public health research.
Nope.
But at the time, in order to get published into a journal, you had to go through a peer review process. Yes. But just like everything was rushed, we actually said, you know what, let's just like give everybody like an express lane on publishing, and we're going to bypass peer review and just go into this like quick publishing situation.
Yeah.
So studies were just kind of falling out of the sky.
Well, yeah, and you were doing, people wanted to see the data, and there is this big push in science to have articles put out, preprint is what it's called, before reviewers have put in their comments and things, and then you can pull it back, fix it, put it back out. But at this period in time where I was reviewing manuscripts left and right, I was putting in manuscripts, like it was a wild time to be in science. And by the time you submitted a paper, you were already behind because there were citations you needed to go back for. It was chaotic.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's like almost like you can't give a baby some candy and then take it away. That is what ivermectin became.
But it also becomes highly political.
Mm-hmm.
At this exact same time, public health is saying, don't take ivermectin, get the vaccine.
Right. I mean, you remember, this is when the push was for getting a vaccine out there, and we had this entire process that wasn't new for COVID, but we hadn't really used it a lot, this emergency use authorization. We all heard it, the EUA, right? And this was a way to get things out there quickly. We didn't have time for years and years of research. We needed to act fast. Mm-hmm. And so the people that were pro-ivermectin were accusing the government of not wanting to have ivermectin approved, because if ivermectin was approved, that meant you couldn't have a vaccine approved. Like they were saying there was no room for both ivermectin and a vaccine. And it's just not true.
Right.
Huh. Mm-hmm. That's a major part of the theory that the government is in bed with Big Pharma. Mm-hmm. They wanted the vaccine out because Big Pharma stood to make gazillions of dollars from the vaccines. Mm-hmm. And in order to do this, in order to have this like easy pass to getting the vaccine out, they couldn't have an alternative. Right. So they didn't want you to know about ivermectin. They didn't want ivermectin to succeed.
So explain that when you say that that's not true. Which part is not true, and what is true?
To get an EUA, the emergency use authorization, there had to be a couple of criteria that you had to meet. And one of them, and this is the flashpoint discussion, was that no alternatives. There must be no adequate, approved, and available alternative to the candidate product for diagnosing, preventing, or treating the disease or condition. So that is a little confusing, and it is a gray area. But that is why the EUA was designed. So it had to be a life-threatening situation. The risk had to be worth it, and you had to have something that worked. Mm-hmm. And in the thread of the needle that had to be done was that you couldn't have something already that worked for us to get another emergency use authorization. But the thing is ivermectin was different. Ivermectin was supposedly going to treat COVID, but the vaccines were going to prevent COVID. So it really was an apples to oranges comparison. And the government, and we saw, did allow multiple things to get emergency use authorization. I mean, there were over 400 things. In that 1 year alone, 400 things were given approval.
Which is truly incredible. I mean, just the ability to get that many things forward. And I don't want to speak for all of public health, but we wanted something, and we wanted every opportunity, whether that was prevention or treatment or both. And in an ideal world, neither is going to be able to protect everybody. And so you kind of have to have all these overlapping approaches, from prevention, vaccines, to therapeutics and drug treatments.
Right.
And it didn't matter to public health what those were. It was that people were dying and we didn't have a solution. And these 400 different EUAs had more than enough options if one or two of them got to the public.
Yeah. I mean, and the 400 EUAs, just to be clear, I mean, they weren't all drugs and medications.
No.
Most of them were testing devices and medical devices, but there were about 10 drugs, and including the 3 vaccines, that were approved. So you could, again, have room for a vaccine and a treatment.
Right. I mean, I just want to kind of underscore this, because this is a major talking point right now, that there was an effort to suppress a drug in order to elevate the vaccine. And from what I'm hearing you say, there were other drugs at the same time that we're talking about ivermectin that were also in play.
Look, hydroxychloroquine, it also had an EUA at this time.
Right.
Right? I mean, this is a drug that, in many ways is a synonym for ivermectin. I mean, there were a lot of people pushing hydroxychloroquine, a lot of people pushing ivermectin. The scales have kind of tipped. More people went with ivermectin than hydroxychloroquine, but they're in the same category.
Right. So around this time, and I may have my timeline a little kind of out of whack here because 5 years ago, y'all. This whole horse dewormer thing really became, I think even to this day, the sort of fault line by which a lot of people who mistrust public health feel like they were denigrated, belittled because they were accused of using horse dewormer. And, I just want to get a little clarity on that because, as you pointed out, when ivermectin was first created, its first use was as a veterinary medicine, and it wasn't until 6 years later that it was approved in humans. But, I think most people in this country probably do know, well, at one point knew it because they would use it on horses and cattle and even in their pets, But just kind of take us through, it started becoming this thing where when certain pharmacies and hospitals weren't prescribing or there were instances of people taking the veterinary grade of it. And I remember in Mississippi, there were just calls to Poison Control Center. But what that ended up looking like was, now famously the FDA puts out this tweet about it. And they are saying, and I want to get this right, in 2021, the FDA tweeted out, "You are not a horse. You are not a cow. Seriously, y'all, stop it." And I can't tell you how many people have brought this up to this day to me, that tweet was so insulting, so condescending, and that the people that we've spoken to did not take the horse dewormer medicine. It is still a sore point, that one tweet.
Yeah, I mean, it's because there was a run on ivermectin.
Yeah.
That
people
is what
were
it was.
scared.
That goes back to in summer of 2021.
Yeah, Delta was going crazy. Remember,
and it's
Delta.
hitting places that hadn't had COVID already.
Right.
It's hitting more rural regions of the country.
And it's a more contagious variant.
It's a more contagious variant.
And
people
sicker.
are clamoring it. And right around that time, you've got in September of that year, Joe Rogan comes out and says, I took it.
Laura Ingraham soon after.
Ingraham, the kind of the right-wing media picks up the cause of ivermectin. And they start running with it. And one of the big drivers of that was this feeling of censorship, that big tech, taking its lead from government, is censoring our ability to get the word out about this drug, this miraculous drug. And that Senator Ron Johnson, who held that first hearing, he starts to bang the drums on this. He says big tech puts out a statement in June of 21. He says, big tech and mainstream media believe they are smarter than medical doctors who have devoted their lives to science and used their skills to save lives. They have decided there's only one medical viewpoint allowed, and it is the viewpoint dictated by government agencies. So suddenly ivermectin becomes sort of this point of contention over censorship.
That's right. And I think it still is that today because as we know, now that Meta with Mark Zuckerberg is announcing that it's taking away the fact check, one of the things that happened during COVID was, and you remember the woman we spoke with last week, Melinda, she actually texted me a couple of days ago to say that she posted something on Facebook back in the day about ivermectin because she said that there was a story about how India was handing out packets of ivermectin and it was flagged for inappropriate content by Facebook. The irony is today, it would, in the new era, it would not be. But one other thing I just want to say is that, how many people actually ended up taking this drug? We actually know. There's a JAMA study done in 2023 that found that approximately 1 in 20 people who likely had COVID took ivermectin. So that's like 6% of the population, right?
That's pretty surprising to me.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Ivermectin plus anything else that wasn't really a non-evidence-based treatment. I mean, it was people
That's right. I just want to just correct that. You're absolutely right, Mark. It was ivermectin and any non-evidence-based treatment.
Yeah. So, but ivermectin was extremely popular. I mean, at one point, there were like 90,000 prescriptions a week. I mean, down from before the pandemic, it was 3,000 prescriptions a week for all the things
like
that
25 times more.
I mean, it was a crazy rise. And again, I mean, the FDA is now responding with that tweet because there were poison control center alerts coming out saying, you know, you took the horse version and now you have some side effects and you're even hospitalized. So again, it's like, the public health side of this is that they do need to respond. I mean, now look, the message fell flat and the delivery backfired, and
the media really jumped on that, by the way. I mean, there were many journalists. I remember, look, I worked at CBS News at the time, and I remember thinking like, geez, these idiots taking horse dewormer. I remember saying that out loud, and I was a journalist at the time, and I apologize for saying that because the truth is, yes, there were people taking horse dewormer, but that does not seem like that was the majority of the case.
And just to put yourself again in the shoes of the people taking it, you know, they're hearing from the media, it's a horse dewormer, don't be stupid. They're hearing from public health, well, the evidence is not there, we've got to wait, we got to see. And they have a loved one who's dying.
Yeah.
And they're hearing from their cousin or friends on social media or seeing a headline or hearing from a podcast that this worked for me. This saved my loved one's life. You can very, very quickly start to see how people would say, I'm told it's safe. It's been around.
Mm-hmm.
It's for humans. I want it. I have to get it. This is my one shot.
And the more we talked about it being bad, and the more we talked about it being good, the more news stories there were about it. That was all at the same time as the prescriptions were going up.
Yeah.
So it was, you know, front and center because for a variety of reasons, but in the end, people took it.
Now we're going to hear from Dr. David Boulware. And I want to tell you a little bit about him because he is the ivermectin guy.
Mm-hmm.
He's an infectious disease physician and a researcher at the University of Minnesota. And he has a specialty in running clinical trials. And David's one of the leading researchers who he studied whether ivermectin was effective on COVID. So let's meet David. Hi, Dr. Boulware.
Good day, or good morning, good afternoon.
Yeah, whatever time of day it is. It's really good to see you. Look, I want to start off by saying at the very top of this episode, I told our audience that there is a scientific consensus that ivermectin does not cure, prevent, or treat COVID. And my first question to you is I want to know how much of a scientific consensus are we talking like the measles vaccine doesn't cause autism, sure? Or is there still like a sliver of, a door crack open?
I think the door is relatively closed at this point. Things have changed quite a bit over the last 4 or 5 years now. And so when things were initially described in, April of 2020 of like, oh, there's some possible activity in a test tube sort of in vitro, that that's sort of one level of evidence versus sort of going through clinical trials and multiple clinical trials finding exactly the same finding over time has really generated a fairly uniform scientific consensus on the topic.
David, there's so many anecdotes that we're hearing of people that believe in ivermectin. Some think, it prevented them from getting COVID. Some feel that if they got it, it kept them out of the hospital. Others, if they were hospitalized, it helped save their life. It helped them avoid long COVID or recover from long COVID. Is there anything that we're seeing in the research that supports any of these beliefs?
Well, when you look at COVID is a good example of many things in medicine where some people will spontaneously get better. And so with COVID, 98% of people with their first episode of COVID, don't become hospitalized and do quite well overall. And so, but that doesn't mean everyone does. But the problem is if you have your one individual perspective, obviously that's very informative for yourself, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the medicine that you took, regardless of what medicine it was, necessarily helped you.
Yeah. I mean, David, how sure are you or how confident are you that the trials you designed answer all of those questions? Because we still keep hearing people say it does help. Like, how do you know what you did settles it?
I think when you look at each trial, they're designed differently. And so one trial doesn't answer every question. And so the trials that I was primarily involved with looked at early treatment. And so if you took ivermectin, did you get hospitalized less? Did you die less? Did your symptoms go away faster? And so how we compared that was with what's termed a placebo. And so we took an identical sort of placebo tablet, which was talc, was an inactive substance, and it looked exactly the same. It was made by the manufacturer, looked exactly the same as the ivermectin. And so half the people got the ivermectin and half the people got the placebo tablet. And so with that, you can see, how did people do? And so when the doctor's giving the tablets and the pharmacist giving the tablets and the patients don't know what they're receiving, you can look and see what happens. And so that's sort of the concept of a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial where you collect the outcomes and you see what happens. And so people have biases. The patient wants to get better. The doctor wants to give a medicine that makes the patient better. And so when you have a blinded trial, all of those biases are controlled. And if you have a large enough population and people are randomly assigned to different intervention groups, then you can see what happens and you can generate data. That becomes sort of the gold standard evidence. And so when you look at the trials have to be performed for exactly what they were tested for. And so as far as early treatment or hospitalization treatment, there's not any evidence that it's of benefit. Now, the question of recovery from long COVID is a different question, and there haven't really been very good trials on that specific topic.
We're obviously focusing on the breakdown of trust. How do you explain it that we've come to a place where science, as you see it, has given us this answer about this drug, and yet a lot of people just simply don't believe it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that COVID is somewhat unique because it's become very politicalized, unlike most of medicine where, whether drug A works or drug B works better, usually people don't have an opinion. They just want the data, and doctors sort of sort through that data to figure out what works best. And this is something that's generated over, years and decades of scientific evidence for any given condition, whether it's high blood pressure or diabetes or whatever. There's always new things coming along, and the new thing may be better than the old thing, or it may not be. And so you want to have good data to make those decisions. When COVID first started, basically the medical establishment didn't have anything to offer people. And so when the advice was, if you get sick, just go home and stay at home. And if you get really, really sick, go to the hospital. And so that's kind of just not very good advice for the most part, because people want something to make them feel better, and ideally make them feel better faster. And so when the medical establishment, whether it's NIH or sort of CDC or other sort of authoritative bodies, don't have anything to offer people, then there will be people that will step forward and offer solutions. And so some of that is sort of the inherent experimentation and testing, which is great. Nothing wrong with that. Other people just want to sell stuff to make money. And so they're going to offer, we live in a capitalist society, and they will offer something, whether it has any benefit or not, to make money. And so in the absence of the vacuum of people offering, the medical establishment offering anything, people will step forward to offer solutions.
I think that's a really interesting point, David. It kind of seems like public health might have, in some ways, inadvertently fanned the interest in ivermectin. And, the language from we don't have sufficient long-term studies to say it's effective, so we don't recommend you take it. But people were, afraid. And while public health was calling for patience and waiting for the data to come out, people were dying and there was fear. And so you can understand why this isn't quite a satisfying answer for people who are waiting for a solution. And it's probably very similar for people who are waiting for treatments for long COVID, if there's still this little bit of hope that there's a treatment that could come off the shelf and help.
Right. it almost feels like there's two things happening, because during COVID, it was people were waiting for the data. So there was some understanding of why someone might even consider a drug that was once called a wonder drug, and in a study that was later found to be a bad study, showed that it kept viruses from replicating. But then now, David, I'm curious as to what you think about this. Now it's more about the suppression of someone's lived experience, that big pharma is trying to push their vaccines. So you have to sort of keep the truth out about ivermectin. So it's sort of shifted. And I'm just curious as to your opinion on that.
I think that, early on in the epidemic, when there's no data, the concept of trial and error of like, well, this medicine is probably not going to harm you. So sure, if you want to try this, that's fine. And so that's the discussion that patients and doctors have every day of like, well, there's not great evidence for this, but it's something that you can try, and it may be beneficial or it may not be, but it's unlikely to harm you. And so the one of the fundamental premises of medicine is first do no harm. And so that's fine when there's no data, but once there becomes data that's actually out there, then when you're sort of willfully ignoring the data, that's very different. And so, with ivermectin, as far as early treatment, there's no data that it's beneficial. It doesn't shorten the duration of illness. It doesn't prevent hospitalization. It doesn't prevent long COVID any better than placebo. But there actually are medicines that do work. And so you could say, well, is the government or big pharma suppressing some of those things? And once again, the government's certainly not perfect in this respect, but there are particularly medicines that have been shown to have some benefit over time, from big pharma, some that are repurposed generic medicines, and so that are very inexpensive, that no one's making any money off of. But because no one's making any money off of them, no one's promoting them because they're too inexpensive.
Right. And so one of the things I also heard you say, or read that you had said when the FDA had sent that tweet out about, you're not a horse, don't use horse dewormer, and also just some of the media coverage around ivermectin. I think even you, a leading ivermectin researcher, you weren't too thrilled with the media coverage back then either. Tell us a little bit about that.
No, I think that was not a very helpful tweet that the FDA put out. I think making fun of people or vilifying people is not super helpful in trying to sort of steer public health sort of discussion. With our experience with hydroxychloroquine, we did some of the early hydroxychloroquine trials, and that was sort of, I guess, that was ivermectin 1.0. I guess before ivermectin was a thing, there was hydroxychloroquine, and with that trial. As you recall, some of the early data came out in early to mid-March. We launched a trial on sort of March 17th of 2020. And within about 3 weeks, it had become very divided, where, half the people believe that hydroxychloroquine didn't work, and why would you want to be in a randomized clinical trial? The other half totally believe that hydroxychloroquine did work, and why would you want to be in a randomized clinical trial? Because you could be randomized to placebo. And so no one wanted to be in the trial. And so we'd enrolled about 3,000 people across 3 different trials for prevention, post-exposure prophylaxis, or early therapy. And we couldn't enroll anyone else because basically opinions were pretty set in stone by really kind of mid to late April, such that the trials ended. It would have been nice to have a little bit more people in the trials, but we got a fairly good conclusion that hydroxychloroquine, once again, didn't work. There wasn't a benefit for early treatment, for post-exposure prophylaxis, pre-exposure prophylaxis, or once you're hospitalized from other trials. And so there were a bunch of trials that came out in rapid succession that all basically showed the same thing, that there wasn't benefit of that. And so people kind of moved on, and ivermectin was the thing that popped up next, as far as sort of, hey, here's a new wonder drug that has in vitro activity, and people swear by it. And so it's a challenge.
It's almost, we're at an impasse here. I mean, if you look at the science on the side of ivermectin works. I mean, I just checked last night. There are groups, and I'm just going to read it. They have, you said you had, 10,000 some people in the active trial. You did multiple trials all across the country. You feel really confident in your work. They do the same. They say they have 105 trials, 220,000 patients, and there is a statistically significant lower risk of everything bad: mortality, ventilation, ICU, hospitalization, recovery, and that it works. I mean, it's like we're both looking at the same thing, and you say it doesn't work, and they say it works. And these are doctors on both sides. And then now we have the public. Who are they to believe?
Yeah, I think that's where it is a challenge, because there's noise coming from both sides. And sort of the medical establishment has really gone quiet on this issue, because 99.9% of doctors have kind of moved on and don't use it. And so those that are probably the loudest on social media are the ones that are promoting it. So like they're the ones promoting it. They're also perhaps the ones, selling it or selling access to it. And so they have a vested interest in that. Most people have moved on. And so there's really no pushback from that on social media, because like, that's not, my job is not to debunk ivermectin. Like we did the trial, we published the data, we shared the data widely, and we have sort of moved on from that.
But let me ask you something about that, David. Does that frustrate you at all that there's no one really championing that? I mean, we had heard a clip from Joe Rogan where he had spoken just a few weeks ago about ivermectin. You have Mel Gibson on Joe Rogan just a couple of nights ago talking about ivermectin. Do you feel as though there needs to be a kind of a roar from either media or the medical community or something to keep defending it? Or is the fact that you did the trial in your mind enough and we have to move on?
It depends. Like usually I would say, one of my goals really when I do trials is to try to change guidelines, change international, treatment guidelines. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has to believe it or buy into it. Like there's, physicians, the goal is for them to look at the data and make their own decision. And so there's guidelines, there's journal articles, there's various ways up to date. There's various ways that people get their information. And ideally, there's a physician that's involved that is sort of, the practice of medicine, and they're sort of filtering all that data down and sharing it with their patients. Now, with telemedicine, you can go direct, on the internet. You don't necessarily need to see your local family primary care doctor, and people can seek out, who they want on the internet, and then, who's to gatekeep that. And so, if they have a medical license and they're legally practicing medicine in that state, then it's really up to the state medical board to, if they're going to take any action against such things. And historically, there's been pretty wide latitude for physicians to practice medicine how they want to. And so some of that is you want to encourage innovation, you want to encourage cutting edge care. At the same time, there can be people that are really kind of outside of the norms of medical practice. And historically, that's been up to state medical boards or hospitals or insurance companies to gatekeep as to what they find acceptable.
Yeah, it seems to, I guess, strike us that you're describing sort of medicine where I'm informed, I trust my doctor, we make a decision that's best for me, that's sort of my business. But when it moves over into public health, the decisions I make affect everybody in my community. Are you worried about kind of where we're heading, where more and more people are saying, I heard about the studies, that's not my experience. My experience is this drug works and I want it and I've got a doctor who's aligned with me and we're going to take it. Or I've heard about the studies about vaccines, but that's not where I am. I think they're dangerous. I'm not taking them. Are you worried about that when you step back and look at public health in this country?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, particularly kids and vaccines, because their parents are making decisions for them on their behalf. And, the vaccine rates dropped quite a bit in the last 5 years. And so of, kids entering into elementary school, like only 95% are sort of fully vaccinated. And so as that trickles down, you're going to have more and more, spread of, potentially, contagious diseases, communicable diseases that can be totally prevented with vaccination. And so the thing like measles, and so measles is incredibly transmissible by airborne route. Is probably the most transmissible virus. And so as the population immunity starts to drop, you're going to have measles outbreaks. And so that's totally unnecessary and can have, serious, damage to kids and neurologic damage and long-term consequences of that.
Yeah. If you had an opportunity to address a big room of people who are skeptical of mainstream science, public health, what would you want to say about what you do, about your relationship with pharmaceutical companies, and about their belief that something really works? What would you say to them if you were addressing them?
Great question. I think that part of it explaining the scientific process a little bit. That science is messy. There's different types of sort of scientific evidence. There's the individual one-person sort of experience, which we would call a case report in essence. There's sort of observational data, which might be either retrospective looking backwards or prospectively looking into the future. And then there's randomized trials. There's sort of single-arm trials which don't have a control group, and then sort of randomized trials where you have a control group. And then there's sort of double-blind trials, and sort of talking through that process of how scientific evidence is generated. Because just because something is observationally true, or observationally, I guess, sort of, you make an observation, doesn't mean it's correct. And randomized trials are really the best way from trial and error really over the last century or more of how you can give a medicine to a patient and there's a placebo effect. So that's one aspect. And you don't know what the natural history is going to be. And so what's going to happen in the future with or without the medicine. So some people may get better over time, just based on natural history. Other people may not. And so if you give a medicine, does that change that natural history? I think the other thing is the placebo effect is really huge. And so this is something that's actually, it's a real thing. It's very, it's been studied over the years, and it's a thing that also applies with COVID, where the placebo effect can make people feel better. And that's an important concept, that if you give something, even if it doesn't work, people are going to feel better, at least transiently, than if you don't give them anything at all.
And just on that point of, because this is something we hear a lot about, which is that ivermectin was cheap and available, and people didn't want the use of it because they wanted to make room for these vaccines that were going to make these big fat cat pharma companies rich. Just address that for a second, because honestly, David, that is such a point for these folks that we're speaking with who are mistrustful of science right now.
Yeah, I mean, the cost of the vaccines, initial cost of the vaccines, the U.S. government bought were like $25, and so they're relatively inexpensive. And so did the pharmaceutical companies make money off of $25 vaccines? Yeah, if you sell millions and millions of them, they do. But they also make money off of therapeutics. And so but the reason why were vaccines developed? People that were vaccinated were people who had survived their initial COVID and got COVID a second time, the same sort of concept. If you have your immune system is primed and has seen the virus or any sort of antigen, but in this case of the SARS-CoV-2 virus beforehand, you can mount a better immune response much faster, and you don't get as sick. And so that concept of sort of what's termed adaptive immunity, is something that happens naturally if you survive your initial infection, but also a vaccine can do. And so even before there was vaccines, most people survived childhood illnesses like measles and chickenpox and rubella and all sorts of various things. But the amount of childhood death was much, much higher back then. And so, if you don't have to have a bunch of childhood death, vaccines are quite good. And so, is there a big conspiracy of pediatricians who don't want children to die? Yes, I guess you could say, that's the whole concept of pediatrics, that they don't want children to die. Do you have to have vaccines to do that? Yes. And so I think that's the goal of a lot of medicine, is to keep people alive and to sort of alleviate suffering. And so doctors tend to use the best tools that are available.
When you set off to study ivermectin for COVID, it's safe to say you were hopeful it would have proved to work, right?
Yeah, I was open-minded when before we started the trial. I was very open-minded because there was some prelim data, there was some lab-based data, and the same with hydroxychloroquine. Before we started the trial, there was some lab-based data, some bad data, but some data say, maybe there's a benefit here. And so ultimately, you needed a large randomized clinical trial to answer the question. And so if you enroll over 1,000 people, and half of them get ivermectin, half of them don't, and you see what happens. And so, we showed in multiple different trials conducted in multiple different locations in the U.S., abroad, in Brazil, that ivermectin did not have any benefit. And so it wasn't, and so that was the thing. And you say, one trial could be bad, or one trial, maybe there's something weird about the trial. But we have multiple different groups investigating this, and they all kind of come up with the same answer, 1, 2, 3 trials that are large, appropriately designed. You kind of get the answer. The kind of the truth is present.
David, you touched on a point that I want to go back to. You said you put out all of this science, you did the research, and you did your job. And it really wasn't your job to be the cheerleader. So you're a researcher, you now have to pass the baton to public health. Is there anything that you wish or could, public health have done differently? What would you have liked to seen?
Well, I would say first off, it wasn't really my job. That most of my work was all sort of pro bono and on the side. So, as a sort of a volunteer researcher, there's only so much free time I can, sort of carve out of my day to run trials that I'm not really paid for. So that's sort of one misconception. The second aspect is, what would you do differently? What would I do differently? I think part of that really starts with leadership at the top, and so that's a unified sort of message. Within the government. So from the executive branch on downwards, to have a very uniform, transparent message that has data behind it as well. And so that process, that concept of leadership, that really applies at all levels of the government, both within the executive branch, within CDC, other sort of groups. And so that the concept, there will always be people that disagree. That's fine. That's the nature of democracy. People can disagree. Doesn't mean they're right, but they can certainly have the right to disagree. I think also from a non-communicable disease perspective, you can do whatever you want in the U.S. as long as it doesn't harm somebody else for the most part. But with communicable diseases, there is a role for public health, and that concept needs to be sort of somewhat calibrated appropriately. And so the initial response back in April of 2020 of sort of vast lockdowns across the country were probably not necessary in all parts of the country. In certain areas, there was a ton of COVID in the East Coast, in New York City. And so having lockdowns there and having a sort of a calibrated response based on the local epidemiology would have been much, much better than just a sort of a simplistic, we're going to shut down everything in the US, we're going to sort of ban all international travel. And so there is some level of that initially in April of 2020 that really kind of turned people off. That, the country was initially very united in sort of March of 2020, and doctors and nurses were actually looked favorably upon, and people were thankful for the jobs that people were doing. And then sort of things become very poisoned, and you had people that are giving death threats out to doctors, and because of what they're doing, and so it's very sort of different. And so how do you fix it for the next time? And so that's the harder part, because you now have a big distrust and sort of anti-vaccine movement that's taken off. And so it's really important, sort of the leadership of the government, of HHS and other places, to have appropriate leaders in place that are going to look at the data and look at science. And so you can't say, oh, I'm just going to follow the science when there's no data. But when there is actually data, you need to look at it. At the same time, you need to set the agenda. And so what is the scientific agenda for data that's actually needed? And so for long COVID, I think there's a lot of unknown within that entity still. And so we need more data. And so you can't say like, oh, XYZ does not work because it didn't work for early COVID, so therefore it's not going to work for long COVID. So you can't automatically jump to those conclusions.
I think that's such a good point.
But you can certainly set the agenda for what data does need to be collected.
David, I think that's such a good point, that long COVID and acute COVID are very different. And so putting a focus on treatments for the 1 in 5 U.S. Americans who have long COVID and treatment opportunities is still something that needs to be, we're 5 years out from SARS-CoV-2 and the outset of the pandemic, but there's a huge number of people who are still affected by the circulating virus and who are suffering long-term effects from the first handful of waves. And they need to be considered in clinical trials moving forward and having medical interventions that are going to improve the quality of life, because it's a hugely debilitating condition.
Absolutely. I think that's where does that come from? So that comes from typically NIH or philanthropy. And so who sets the NIH budget? Well, that's Congress. And so that's really then Congress that then needs to listen to, the electorate, the population of citizens, to help drive that agenda. And Congress then needs appropriate money for that to happen. And they say, well, we gave money in 2021. Like, okay, well, that was a long time ago. And so they did do that in 2021. I think they invested $1 billion. And so they could say, well, what was the return on investment? And I think rightfully so, they could say, we did not get a very good return on investment. So should we give any more money? And so, well, that's probably not the answer. The answer might be to do something different than what was done before, or describe how are they going to do something different to try more things to get better answers. But it's an area that I think there's still an important need, and it's something that medicine, once again, is not addressing very well at all right now. And so the medical establishment really has very little to offer.
David, I just want to thank you so much for joining us, for speaking so honestly. I know that listeners who perhaps feel a little abandoned by public health and the medical establishment, I think will also appreciate a lot of what you had to say. But at the same time, for you to set the record straight based on your work and your hard work, often unpaid, it seems, I think will go a long way. So I just really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
All right. Well, welcome back, friends. I thought that was super interesting.
Yeah.
And, the thing that really struck me is we started off laying the case for why ivermectin was this super politically charged tool that was used, and it's so fraught. And then you hear from somebody like David Boulware, who is sort of almost, and I mean this as a compliment, in a very, a deadpan way, talking about the science in just, this is just what happens, right? Whether you agree with their findings or not, it's a process.
Yeah.
Yeah. And both sides, it's interesting, both sides feel that they are repping scientific method. Scientists like Dr. Boulware saying we're doing these rigorous, double-blind, gold standard, large population studies, and we're coming up with an answer. And sort of the other side is saying, hey, I'm seeing these things with my own eyes. This is my lived experience. Yeah. And we're rattling the whatever, saying, hey, we got to ask more questions. This thing is not settled. Science is about challenging and asking questions and finding new answers and continuing to pursue this. So it's a real clash.
I think that's why when we first started talking, when you had brought up ivermectin as a topic, me as a virologist was like, well, what are we going to talk about? This is this is settled. The data at that point to me had been very clear because of David's publications and others that there wasn't efficacy there. But the thing that I hadn't appreciated is the anecdotes that people really felt more identity with than the data that was coming out.
Those anecdotes also cut both ways.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are folks who have talked about their loved ones taking ivermectin and it didn't work, and they died in the hospital.
Regret.
And there's regret attached. There's some lawsuits currently being filed against telemedicine companies for charging pretty astronomical amounts. I mean, we talk about big pharma and vaccines. There was a lot of money to be made on ivermectin by a lot of pretty unsavory characters. And again, I have so much empathy for somebody who, in the early days of the pandemic, when there was no vaccine and all treatments were kind of on the table, and even in the later days of the pandemic may have been hesitant to take the vaccine. I can understand where there may have been a desire to try something out that, by the way, like Tom said, had won a Nobel Prize, had been called a wonder drug. All of that
Very
makes
well
sense
tolerated.
to me.
Yeah.
It's really that there were also some nefarious activities going on to try to push ivermectin on people, and I want to just make that point as well.
Yeah, I mean, listening to him, I mean, he's dedicated so much of his career at this point to answering this question. And, the question may be not even scientific anymore. I mean, this is a societal debate. This is a political debate. And we're knocking on his door to answer that question.
Right.
I mean, how is it that the scientific method, and since when is a randomized controlled clinical trial going to answer a societal or a political debate or an ideological debate? And I think that's where we're in this swamp of confusion, and we just keep asking science to answer something for us that maybe it can't.
And the politics are huge in this. I mean, you have one side that sort of wanted to approach a public health crisis through prevention with vaccine and just held up its nose to any of these treatments that weren't, solid evidence-based treatments. And then you have a whole other side, Red America, that's saying, I don't want the vaccine. I don't want prevention. Give me treatment.
Yeah.
That's the thing I believe in. And is that sort of how we're going to barrel forward into 2025, 2026? Is that we're going to have two different approaches to a public health crisis depending on your politics?
I hope not. As a scientist, I think we need both. You need to have preventative measures and you need to have treatment measures. And it's just really interesting because Operation Warp Speed was part of a Republican administration, and it's such an incredible feat of science and humanity to have vaccines for an unknown virus previous to that point within a year. The mountains that were moved to do that are wild. And similar mountains can be moved for therapeutics, and maybe that's an angle that should be taken up, is that we can have that.
I thought it was also interesting that he talked about leadership and he talked about the medical establishment being too quiet right now. We are in a moment where there are such incredible voices, loud voices, advocating on behalf of those who believe in ivermectin, who believe in the skepticism of the establishment, from, whether it's Joe Rogan to Robert F. Kennedy, obviously the president himself, Fox News. There are a lot of voices that are loud in that arena. And I just don't know who there is that is advocating for people like David Boulware and his science. So I don't know what the answer is to that, but it seems that is a situation that feels kind of imbalanced.
And they're not willing to talk to each other, right? So now we're in a situation where you have a fixed false belief. And another word for fixed false belief is delusional, right? Are we at a point where we're delusional to expect that a drug that we've proven through trials doesn't work? Is it delusional to still keep using it? Is it ethical to still keep using it? I mean, doctors still have latitude, and he talked about that a little bit, that doctors can still prescribe, and, if you feel like it might help, and you can go off label. But at some point, are we really shooting ourselves in the foot by still just digging our heels in? Because no side wants to admit that they were wrong, or they were maybe wrong about this, but maybe not about that. And we really do have these egos in place that we've got to work around.
Mm-hmm. And you were talking about establishment, public health establishment. That's all changing, right? There's a new guard coming in. So who's establishment now? The dissident voices are now the establishment voices, and the establishment voices are now going to become the dissident voices. So if we ever, God forbid, have another pandemic, can you imagine the confusion that's going to be, blared out to everybody in the public as to what they're supposed to do?
The messaging wasn't coming from one cohesive place. And that's been a key pillar, it seems like, in what led to the distrust, is because people were scared and looking for the information. And when there's so many voices, and some of them are much louder than others, and you have to choose as an individual, who do I listen to?
Yeah. Well, look,
it gets messy.
A first step, I think, is probably to listen and turn the temperature down a little bit in order to do that. Because, look, the media environment, it rewards sensationalism, it rewards conflict. But the truth is, these are conversations that really should be done in quieter spaces where cooler heads can prevail. And I'm for one, I'm optimistic that we can do that, and that the country's ready for those conversations. That's the feedback we've been getting.
We all want to live.
Yeah,
we can all
live.
agree. We all want to live.
We want to live, and we want to thrive, and lives and livelihoods. I believe that both are possible. So on that note, because I don't want to end on a dark note, so let's end on a brighter note. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us again. We're a new show. It means everything to us to have you join us on this journey as we talk about these issues. Please click subscribe. If you do click like. You can also email us questions, comments, any ideas you have at questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net. Thank you so much, and we'll see you